Okay, I guess I'll begin. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Laura Miller. I'd like to welcome you to today's event. It's sponsored by the Eiichi Shibusawa Seigo Arai Endowed Professorship in Japanese Studies and by UMSL Global. And today I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mindy Landek. Dr. Landek received her PhD in East Asian history from the University of Kansas in 2015. And as you can see, she is currently an associate professor of East Asian studies at Austin College. Because Dr. Landek has a record of outreach and of creating educational experiences for the general public, I thought that she would be a perfect speaker for us this week at UMSL because this is the International Education Week. And so when I was trying to think of somebody to invite her, I immediately thought of her and all of her activities that she does. And Dr. Landek also has worked with national organizations to facilitate professional development for secondary education. So please join me in welcoming her for the talk on Don't Mind the Gap, Teaching Japan Beyond Academic Specialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by expressing my thanks to Dr. Miller and UMSL Global for the opportunity to share ideas with you all today here on the cusp of our Thanksgiving breaks. And as a part of the programming for International Education Week, which we are marking at my campus as well today. One of the few silver linings of this weird pandemic period we're all still enduring has truly been that we have gained this new conversance with participating in virtual events such as this one.
Excuse me, Mindy, the sound, the audio is disappearing again.
Oh dear, okay, let's try finding a different microphone. How is this?
I can hear you now.
Okay, please alert me if it happens again. I'm not sure why that's happening, but I'll keep switching microphones for as long as we need to do so. You can hear me now, Laura?
Yes.
Okay, good deal. But thank you again for the invitation to join you today. I'm hoping that you'll be able to continue to hear me, and I'm really delighted to be with you this afternoon. Today, I'm hoping we can open a dialogue around several issues that touch on concerns that are shared by higher ed educators.
The mic is going again.
Oh dear. One thing that might, let's see here. USB. How is it now?
That's good.
Okay, I may have to change cameras. I'm wondering if the mic is in the camera. So if it happens again, I'll switch video cameras and see if that does something. All right, where was I? Oh, yes. So I want to have a dialogue around concerns that we feel as people in Japanese studies and think through how we can together navigate these contemporary challenges. Positionality and perspective, I think, are important aspects of this conversation. And so I'd like to start by trying to better define the position from which I'm personally approaching these issues. I am now, as Dr. Miller said, an associate professor of East Asian Studies at Austin College. I earned tenure less than a week ago. And we are a small private liberal arts college located not in Austin, but rather about an hour north of Dallas on the Texas-Oklahoma state line. My training is as a cultural historian of early modern Japan, and I am a self-defined academic late bloomer. There was a gap of nearly a decade that fell between my completion of an MA in East Asian Studies at Yale almost 20 years ago now, and the commencement of my doctoral studies at the University of Kansas in 2008. And that gap is important to our conversations today because of how I spent those 10 years. And I spent them in a variety of what I'll call para-academic roles. I worked as an adjunct instructor of Japanese language and East Asian history at Colorado State University and the University of Wyoming, and then also at the University of Colorado as a professional research associate with the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia, doing things like summer workshops on topics in East Asia, public outreach Asia Day events, and even leading study tours for in-service school teachers from Colorado in Japan and elsewhere. That work included a lot of public-facing scholarships, presentations on topics in Japanese studies that ranged from Kyogen theater to Japanese tea ceremony, and held at venues that include Japan America societies, public libraries, school classrooms, and municipal Japan festivals, among others. So my motto has very long been, have laptop, will travel. And I don't think that's really changed now in my professional life. So all of which is to say that I come by this gray hair honestly, having now clocked more than 20 years of work in the field of Japanese studies at land-grant universities, and now for the last 6 years at this very small private liberal arts college with 110 faculty in total and a student body of about 1,200 students. So I've entitled this talk, Don't Mind the Gap, Teaching Japan Beyond Academic Specialization. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about how this idea for this talk kind of came to be. In the fall of 2017, I was a new professor at this campus teaching a first-year seminar for freshmen. And their topic was animals in Japanese history and imagination. And perhaps as befits my identity as a Gen X extrovert, I was making a number of social media posts about this teaching. Yokai are a wonderful, fun topic. And so I was sharing this on social media. This caught the attention of some colleagues, and as a result, I was invited to develop a webinar on Japanese monsters for the 5 College Center for East Asian Studies at Smith. I was flattered by the invitation, but initially I declined because my primary point of research is on the cultural history of warrior practitioners of Japanese tea ceremony between the 17th and 19th centuries. This has nothing to do with monster culture, as you may well intuit. So I responded with thanks and then provided the names of 2 scholars of yokai studies, a discrete field nowadays of Japanese studies, to the director of the program who had invited me. And I'll never forget what Anne Prescott, who is the director of the 5 College Center, said to me in her response. She said, "Mindy, we have already asked Professor X and Professor Y to give this talk, and they have declined to be available to do so. I can tell from the kinds of things you're posting on social media that you are more than prepared to do a fabulous job of presenting this material to our audience. But if it's not you, it really will be nobody. And so the teachers will not have this opportunity if you choose not to do it." And you know what? After a little bit of reflection, I realized she was absolutely right. And so it did not matter that I was not the best, the most qualified, the most expert person to present this material, because I did know a lot more about it than the average person on the street. And more importantly, I was willing and I was available. And so here's the thing with outreach work. At some level, just doing it is really the bottom line. And this required for me to push back on my innate imposter syndrome, right? My ideas about what my professional niche was and was not, and simply making myself available to show up and do it in the same way that I had already done it in my own classroom. And of course, that made all the difference. I was able to introduce roughly 40 participants to material that they could immediately implement in their own teaching if they so chose. And they wouldn't have had that option if I hadn't gotten over myself, right? So I initially offered that webinar in early 2018. But I think what's more interesting than just being willing to sort of get out of the comfort zone and do something that's not in my sort of defined field of official expertise is what happened afterward. And what ensued was a kind of domino effect of things that sprang from stepping outside of the initial comfort zone and being willing to abandon or at least look around the corners of my defined niche pool of knowledge, right? So here's what happened as a result. Fast forward to the early days of the pandemic. It's April 2020. Everything is shut down. And my husband, who is the programming director for a large library district in a nearby city, was at our quarantine kitchen table racking his brains to figure out what kinds of programming the library could possibly provide their patrons when the doors were still locked, right? And I had a brainchild. I suggested, why don't I repackage this content that I had delivered a year previously as a talk for the general public? I had it, so to speak, in the can. And what's more, I had another couple of talks that I had given at many public venues and knew appealed to general audiences. And so really I could turn around in the matter of just a couple of days, put those on the scheduling as public programming for him during the pandemic. Word of mouth got around because I'm a blabbermouth, right? Some of my colleagues got wind of this, and they also stepped forward to offer an additional 3 sessions. So we put those out very quickly. They were all extremely well attended and well received. The next domino to fall was that this word of this outreach effort was picked up by the PR department of the school and eventually reached the ears of our dean of faculty. In short order, she reached out to me and one of those other scholars and asked us to put together a summer 2020 mini course offered for free to new incoming freshmen as a retention effort in that uncertain moment when we were not sure that our new arriving incoming class was actually going to show up on campus. What do you suppose the topic was that I chose? Of course, I knew that monsters would be fun and appealing subject matter for this group. So I expanded this 1-hour webinar into a 3-week summer mini course for those new freshmen. Many of those 23 students in that mini course subsequently immediately signed up for courses in the EAS catalog based on a positive experience with that course. So our course enrollments went up. We were happy about that. And then that same year, when COVID forced me to cancel a planned Jan term for January 2021, in which I was supposed to take students to South Korea and Kyoto, I decided to instead offer on campus, because we could not travel internationally, the Monsters course is a full credit Jan term course instead, taught in a hybrid model, mostly over Zoom. And of course, teaching it over Zoom allowed me to bring in over 8 experts from all over the world, Australia, UK, Japan, and all over the United States. I was able to bring in these yokai experts, novelists, artists, fellow teachers, a Godzilla expert, among others, right? Greatly enriching that Jan term course. And now, through one of those experts in the network that I created around that course, I am thinking through the process of planning a January 2025 travel Jan term to sites in Japan associated with yokai lore. The point I'm trying to make is that when you redirect your energies and intellectual curiosity into new knowledge fields and then allow yourself to publicly share and disseminate those findings, the professional dividends can be unexpectedly rich, and they certainly were in this particular instance. So what I'd like to sort of think around as a group is, as Japanese studies and area studies programs more generally face another moment that we can characterize, I think, accurately as existential threat, being in another moment of precarity, right? What avenues are still available to us as scholars to reinvigorate and to protect the field? And I decided to sort of come up with these framing questions that kind of touch upon several things that I'm hoping we can talk about tonight. So what are the challenges that Japanese studies as a discipline faces in the current moment? What are the promises and also the limits of academic expertise? And this depends a lot on how we define that term. Is it worthwhile to exit your intellectual niche? What are the risks of doing that? And then finally, how can we optimize public scholarship and responsive pedagogy to preserve and protect our field to whatever extent we are able to do so? Look, I'm hardly the first person to consider these challenges. In March of 2019, a group of several senior scholars in the field assembled a panel at the annual AAS meeting in Denver. And they gave it the somewhat depressing title of The Death of Japanese Studies, right? This panel drew a large crowd for discussion on the perils of shrinking departments, the various challenges of which most of us in higher ed are already all too aware. Shrinking tenure lines, of a really anemic academic job market, declining interest in enrollment in Japanese language courses, demographic shifts and the threat of a demographic cliff, right? When the kids that should have been born in 2008 and 2009 failed to materialize as new freshmen on our campuses, and increasing push toward vocational training as a major emphasis of higher education, right? All of these things kind of contribute to the general malaise that humanities education was laboring under even before COVID showed up and asked us to hold our proverbial beer. So responding to that panel, scholar Grace Ting raised a number of issues pertaining to what she termed the problematic histories and tendencies of our field. I think most fields have these moments of self-reflexive thinking through the past forward, right? And she posed the question of how do we think about the existence of problems that continue to drag on or live within our field? And I think this kind of question was driving many of us at the time. And in fact, I was the member of a roundtable that was assembled by a scholar named Paula Curtis and proposed in response for the 2020 AAS academic conference. And we called our roundtable The Rebirth of Japanese Studies in an attempt to respond in some ways to that previous panel. Dr. Miller, my host today, kindly agreed to serve as our discussant. And of course, that panel, originally scheduled for March 2020, did not take place in person thanks to COVID, but we did present our findings in an online virtual format. And at the close of the talk, I'll drop that link into the chat field for you if you're interested. In her own contribution to that online discussion, Dr. Miller forwarded 3 possible avenues for surmounting the sort of feeling of doom and gloom that surrounded Japanese studies. And I'd like to present them here again today because I think they continue to hold water and in fact dovetail rather nicely with some of the strategies that I would like to suggest in response. Her suggestions were communication with other scholars in Japanese studies outside of our home institutions, the creation of links and collaboration with faculties and other programs, disciplines, and universities, both internally and externally. And then to teach courses that are more accessible and on topics that were appealing to a wide range of students other than just simply our majors. So having borrowed Laura's very applicable 3 points of advice here, I'd like to use them to sort of go through some of the strategies and activities that I and also my colleagues here at Austin College have been implementing in an attempt, again, to reinvigorate and keep our field relevant. So the first of these is the proactive dismantling of knowledge silos that confine us to departments, disciplines, or institutions. In my opinion, it's a time to take a sledgehammer to the imaginary walls behind some of which some of us are prone to hide. Academia efficiently programs us to define expertise in ways that are conceptually narrow. And the structure of the university too often reifies these narrow definitions through the phenomenon of disciplinary knowledge silos. I believe that the kind of invigoration that Dr. Miller is advocating requires as its first step for us to dismantle these as both educators and students, right? We have to deprogram our thinking around adherence to disciplinary norms and structures. And I can say as a recent assistant professor, this is precisely the kind of thing that most graduate programs do not train you to do in the slightest. I arrived at this campus in an area studies program, but with training as a historian. And it took me at least a year and a half to sort of move outside of my thinking in purely historical terms, in terms of how I taught. So for me, I think that this process has been accelerated on two crucial fronts. Firstly, I'm in an area studies program, right? One that despite having only 3 faculty members, again, we are a small campus, 110 faculty total, right? We are quite naturally interdisciplinary in our outlook, right? We are an area studies program, not a history program, not a literature program. So siloing in a place like this is, in fact, very difficult to accomplish at a school of our size, where I literally know every single member of this faculty personally and could pick them out of a lineup, right? So as a result of working in that kind of small institution, I have been able to readily cobble together co-teaching, other kinds of course exchanges and collaborations, both internally and outside of my institution. And I hope to be able to continue that work as I go forward in my career. This brings me to my second strategy, which is to optimize the ways in which our courses contribute to and satisfy the needs of our overall curriculum requirements. At small liberal art institutions like my own, the curriculum is intentionally designed for breadth across all 3 divisions, right? Humanities, social sciences, and the sciences. Our liberal arts model means that I quite naturally will always have students in my courses who would not necessarily ever be in them a second time. They're in there to fulfill these breadth requirements. And while some of them I'll never see again, many of them enjoy the content and willingly, voluntarily come back for more, right? At Austin College, we often say that students will sometimes elect to major or minor in a favorite professor following them from course to course. And in fact, we have more minors in East Asian studies than majors these days. And I think this is why, because we have many people who are on the pre-health track headed for medical school who choose to minor in East Asian studies simply because they enjoy it, right? One of the reasons that we are able to attract students into our courses in the first place is they know that as a department, we have made a commitment to designing courses that will serve multiple requirements of our Compass curriculum at once, satisfying global diversity, humanities breadth, or fulfilling our institution-wide writing curriculum. And then oftentimes some of our courses are cross-listed with other area studies programs such as gender studies or environmental studies. In recent years, when students are more concerned than ever before about graduating on time or even graduating early in an attempt to save on the astronomical price of tuition, courses that overtly help them to fulfill more graduation requirements with alacrity are going to have a natural advantage when registration time comes around. So for example, in spring, a new course that I have designed on Japan's entertainment subcultures is going to fulfill humanities breadth credit, global diversity credit. It's being offered for advanced writing credit, and it will also count as a credit for either the East Asian Studies major or minor, as well as gender studies, right? So this is the kind of strategic positioning I'm talking about. And as a result, our department has been largely spared the kinds of questions from administration about low enrollments. We don't have low enrollments because of these strategies. And to be quite frank, that's not necessarily true of other departments in our humanities division who, for whatever reason, do not wish to sort of employ the same strategy. My feeling is if cuts are to be made, those courses might be cut first because we simply serve a larger number of students. This brings me to Dr. Miller's third point, and I'm going to adopt it as my third point as well, which is, to whatever extent possible, courses should be designed in ways that actively appeal to the interests of our students and to current matters in the news. And this broadens the reach and impact of our quarters in substantial ways. Here's just a quick rundown of courses that I and my close colleague, Dr. Johnson Cooper, have designed in the last 4 years. Dr. Johnson Cooper, who is my chair, is a particular genius at this, and I am learning at her feet. For example, in 2019, as independence protests filled the streets of Hong Kong, she was able to very quickly design and roll out a senior seminar on Hong Kong and the independence movement in short order. As the pandemic closed our campus for the first time in March 2020, she very quickly got on the books a fall 2020 course on the coronavirus that could build on her very popular Chinese medicine course as well. You'll see that among my offerings are a number that are very popular with students, the Monsters course, a Samurai course, but also a course on modern Korean history and culture called The Two Koreas. And it is the fact that one of the central tenets of my time on this campus and my contributions to it has been the development and expansion of our course offerings on Korea. Now, that might ring strange to an audience full of Japanese studies people, but let me explain myself. My fourth strategy is that it behooves us to proactively expand course offerings to address large content gaps, which might, accurately reflect gaps in the training of the faculty that are putting the courses together. We are a faculty of only 3. We are respectively trained in modern Japanese literature, modern Chinese literature, and then myself in early modern or pre-modern Japanese history. When I arrived on this faculty in 2016, there was almost zero coverage of Korean history and culture in our course offerings, despite the fact that we have a decently sizable Korean American student population on this campus, and that the Dallas Metroplex is home to a very large Korean American community. So redressing that situation probably wouldn't have gained much traction had I and my colleagues simply been content to only teach things in which we felt completely conversant. So I proposed at the time of my hire that we do something proactive about this. The first step that we took occurred in early 2018 when my colleague Scott Langton and I applied together to attend an intensive 2-week seminar called Infusing Korean Studies in the undergraduate curriculum at the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. This took place in the summer of 2018, and let me hasten to tell you that the location of this seminar near Waikiki was really a hardship on us that we had to push through. It was really hard. Our action plan upon our return from Honolulu was to create a series of Korean curricular units to plug into our 4 East Asian Studies core courses, which cover China, Korea, and Japan now. And for me, to develop an entirely new advanced credit course that I've called The Two Koreas that will be offered every 2 years. I'm currently teaching that course for the second time. And I'm proud to say it's really come a long way since the first offering of it in 2019. And the students are responding to the material with so much enthusiasm. It is truly a joy to teach. I knew in my first week on the job, there would be a massive demand for this course when a student I didn't know walked into my office, again, first week on the job, and asked me to sponsor a student club around K-pop fandom. I declined. I didn't know anything about K-pop then. I know very little about it now, to be honest, but it was just a little bit too early. But that was my first indication of how popular Korean culture was on this campus. Even beyond the classroom, this willingness on the part of the faculty to learn and to teach outside of our regions and historical periods of training has actually invigorated our entire campus and this program. Over the last 2 years, we've inaugurated new study abroad opportunities in South Korea for students. In fact, just this morning, I and my students were attending a Zoom session with 2 of our current students who are in Seoul and Busan, respectively. And several of them are planning to study South Korea next fall. And I will be utilizing a part of an upcoming sabbatical trip to further network and build relationships with institutions and scholars in South Korea. It's not really an exaggeration for me to say that this work on Korea since 2018 has revitalized my own professional interests to a significant degree. And it has actually also improved my teaching on Japan. So instead of viewing Chinese studies and Korean studies as competitors, I am really very much an advocate of taking a broader approach and viewing them as collaborators in our shared task of educating North American populations about East Asia. And this brings me to another point, which is that creating courses that are trans-regional in focus and that engage experiential hands-on modes of learning, and perhaps even include, when possible, a service learning component. These are all fabulous ways to simultaneously appeal to students and to build connections with the surrounding community. As an example of this, I'd like to sort of offer some insight into my fall 2019 course called Tea in East Asia. This course not only traced the history of tea as a trade commodity and cultural practice across East Asia, but it included a major commitment and logistical challenge of actually allowing students in about half of our course meetings to brew, taste, evaluate, and write about teas that hailed from all over the region. The student response to this course was fantastic, despite all the work and hauling of water that it involved to actually teach it. My preparations to teach it, including undertaking a third of the formal process toward becoming an official tea sommelier, with training that I did in summertime with the Specialty Tea Institute of America, and then to actively network with tea experts in the DFW area and beyond. And although I was already a part of the international tea community with respect to Japanese tea ceremony, which is my personal topic of inquiry, this actually fed into my own research in ways that I could not have anticipated before I did it. And then I would undertake these exchanges with these local tea experts by offering to hold free programs at their storefronts for their customer base in return for them coming to my classroom and having events with my students. We completed that course with a service learning component with an event called a tea open house that my students planned and executed in lieu of a final exam, although they did write a reflection paper on this. And what this event was, students were steeping a variety of teas, more than 20 teas, steeped gongfu style for participants that walked them through the tasting experience and told them what to look for. We even managed to get our college president to stop by. You can see him at the top right of the slide. Sadly, he didn't take to Chinese pu'er. We tried to sell him on it. It didn't work. And then we've done other service learning activities along the way too. For example, twice I've taken my students to the local library system. I know a guy there. I happen to be married to him, and put together activities for kids that I have students design and implement. And these are wonderfully received and also are covered in the local press and are wonderful advertising for our small school. They've come to the attention of our alums and our donors. One final suggestion of a strategy is to lean into new models for assignments, assessments, and to foreground transferable skills in our course designs. I think most of us as educators do this quite naturally, right? We all share a vested interest in fostering student success and in realizing the learning objectives of the courses that we design. I am fortunate here at Austin College, as many schools are, to have a terrific faculty development initiative. Ours is called the Johnson Center. And there's a lot of interaction among the faculty on pedagogical topics, right? So part of my journey on this faculty has been around exploring new methods of assessing student outcomes, rethinking learning objectives, getting creative around the kinds of assignments that I'm having students work on. This brainstorming with and borrowing from or stealing from colleagues has been a really productive way for me to keep my classes relevant and to keep my teaching fresh. I've been increasingly experimenting with assignments that allow me to depart from my default mode of just assign a paper. Sometimes you have to do that. We do have a writing curriculum, but when I have deviated from it, the results have always been worthwhile. At the divisional level, I am also involved in a project. This is not my brainchild. I am just a worker bee on it, a humanities working group. And I'm happy to say that I have to be a little mysterious about it, but we are on the cusp of winning a major grant that will fund this work in a new way. We're super excited about it. We call the program Professionalism in the Humanities. And its objective is to more concretely design courses that allows students to practice 6 core transferable skills that we know employers find desirable in ways, and then allow them to see that they're doing that and articulate that they are doing that as they move into the job market or pursue professional degrees after graduation. For years, this kind of ongoing discourse of the humanities in crisis, right, that we hear a lot about, has emphasized that humanities majors actually demonstrate very good employment outcomes if we just look 5 to 10 years past graduation, right? So the long-term outlook is incredibly good. We know that our humanities majors possess the soft skills that employers find desirable, and that also allows them in many cases to move into management roles. So we feel that if we design courses, we're calling them humanities labs, that are designed in a way to center and highlight those skills and to design the delivery of content around those skills, we can help illuminate the through line that we already know exists between humanities majors and highly employable young professionals. This is really important for recruitment. This is really important for retention. And if you're at a school like mine, where the tuition bill is a sizable number and families have to think long and hard about that investment and what return they will see on it, to sort of show the ways in which that return does come, maybe not the year after graduation, but 5 years out, 10 years out, the rewards are there. We feel like that is something that is really worth working on. So in closing, I feel like I do need to spend a moment to acknowledge all of the ways in which I know that this talk falls short of offering radical new solutions for the biggest problems plaguing Japanese studies. And because these are overarching systemic issues that are largely out of our direct control as teachers. And perhaps in my case, they are well above my pay grade. That said, I would like to suggest that the measures such as those that I've put forward here today, embracing public scholarship, working across disciplines and institutions, and allowing ourselves and our students to express themselves creatively as we learn together, we can actually position Japanese studies as a field ripe for the kind of rebirth of which I absolutely still believe it is capable. To paraphrase the well-known and possibly apocryphal words that are often attributed to Mark Twain, the rumors of our death as a field have been greatly exaggerated. I look forward to your questions and comments, and I hope that we can use the remainder of this time to think through together these and other ways in which we keep our Japanese studies vibrant and significant in the broader public discourse. Thank you so much for your time, and I would love to have a more conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Landeck. That was a really marvelous presentation. And again, I'm always struck by your optimism, your, like you said, the way you embrace this challenge and come up with all kinds of solutions. It's really remarkable. So if anyone has questions, you can post it in the Q&A or the chat. And in the meantime, I mean, one of the problems that I see in several universities that I've been at is while there's always the discourse about being interdisciplinary, working across the aisle, working across disciplines and departments, that in fact the way that resources are allocated is by discipline and department. And so it's sort of, the money that goes to departments. And I mean, I remember when I taught at another school, there was all of this push for us to do joint teaching. And you mentioned that you did some joint teaching, but then they never worked out how people would be paid for that course, or do you have to teach 2 courses to make up for it? And so nobody was willing to do it. And so as much as the rhetoric is there and the discourse is there to, step outside your comfort zone, step outside your narrow field of specialization, in fact, the funding and the rewards don't follow. So there's no real incentive except for, as you made such a great point about, increased student enrollments. And but is that enough to drive faculty to take the leap? You used another, I forgot what you said exactly, but something about the fear of stepping out of the niche abandonment fear or something. And that's exactly what I see a lot of, is this kind of fear of stepping out of the comfort zone of your own discipline and area of studies. I don't know anybody who would, do some of the things that you've done that has had, that has had such perfectly evident payback for the school and for the department in terms of enrollments and in terms of enrichment of your own research and students. And it's only by doing these things that we begin to get the payback. So Mike, so how do we get people to take the leap?
Well, I mean, you've raised a couple of really important things. First is that schools are very often not willing to put their money where the mouth is, right? Yeah. We've run into that here. This working group for the humanities, we are about to get a very large grant. We have worked 5 years to get that because our own administration is either unable or unwilling to fund it, right? I would say, like, currently, especially with a COVID deficit still lingering, we are unable to commit that kind of money, right? So it's going to have to come from outside. And that's the position I think that we find ourselves in all too often, is like, if we really want to shake things up, there has to be a whole lot of basically, gratis work that goes in on the front end, for which there is no institutional remuneration. There might be recognition. I feel like we've had some recognition, we've had support, but that support has not been financial, right? We've had to go outside of the institution to get that. And that again is always the challenge. It's like, how much of this are we doing on our own time without a pay increase? How burned out are we by other institutional demands? I recognize too that I'm at a teaching institution with a very humane and transparent tenure process that is not, sort of the proverbial publish or perish model. And people who are at schools that are still more sort of traditional in their approach or consideration of a tenure case may indeed feel like they cannot abandon that initial research path that leads to a book manuscript and a publication contract and the second project, that is necessary for promotion and to avoid precarity. Very sensitive to that, and certainly know many people at other institutions for whom that is the reality. So genuinely, no judgment for people who don't want to do it. I think perhaps what has given me the courage to do it is the fact that I did have that 10 years to work in outreach in between the master's degree and the PhD. So by the time I started my doctoral program, I had many years of activity and some national recognition and place in that community. And what's more, I could see that there were a number of very well respected senior academics who were also active in it. And I would point to people like Bill Tsutsui, who has always, he's been involved with the Confucian Institutes. I know those are controversial, but he's also had a long period of association with National Consortium for Teaching About Asia, which is how I got to know him first of all. And he, as well as my advisor, Eric Rath, are what ultimately took me to the University of Kansas, I should add. So I've always had mentors and models of senior scholars who did this kind of work. There was probably a point at which Bill, somebody might have told him, don't write a book about Godzilla. You're a historian of Japanese businesses and banking. But that has been his biggest recognized work in some ways, and has led to many other things. So I've seen it actually function successfully as an alternate path that we can direct energies to. Does that mean I'm not still pursuing research on my original dissertation project that I intend to publish and do something with? No, not at all. But I'm finding that the two actually can complement each other in ways that are surprising and unexpected. So that's what I'm saying is, don't abandon your everything about your traditional trajectory,
Right.
but keep in mind that there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I have also, of course, a similar experience of, not really finding that my narrow area of linguistic anthropology was actually not going to, get me very far. So we have some questions.
Just
Bill
with alarm, recognizing that Bill is in the room to hear me talking
Bill
about
Tsutsui, is in the room, and then the chair of my department. Laura Westhoff, what recommendations do you have for a department chair who wants to encourage and support faculty to both individually and together do the kinds of work you've discussed? That is, we now have a very interdisciplinary type of history department. Of course, we also have no money, so there are few carrots.
Nobody's got any money. And this is the universal truth of higher ed. So I think the first thing you do is you get people excited about an idea, right? I think in many cases, like I often did not have any money to do half of the things I did, but I was excited about the content and I was excited about sharing it. And oftentimes I was acting as kind of a lone wolf. But I found that once I kind of put that energy out there, other people got interested and wanted to collaborate because they got wind of my excitement. And I think what happens is when we put this energy out there, it does create a kind of momentum, and that can turn into leverage with your administration, with the powers that be. And then at that point, you can start to maybe get enough money to buy a bunch of carrots, right? I mean, I've seen that happen is like, I come up with an idea, I'm telling myself, I will fund this personally, right? And then when people see the ways that people are responding to it or that the attention it's drawing, money will suddenly be found in some, pocket somewhere that I didn't know it was. And I will be offered money to do more of the same. And so that has happened on a number of occasions. I wish I had a better strategy to suggest to you, Laura. I think I'm still new enough to the sort of political workings of higher ed to not yet intuit all the ins and outs of ways that we can loosen pockets. But I know that like when there is enough energy behind something, and then when it captures the attention of the press, of the public, of potential students and their parents, and of donors, at that point, people will find some money. And so that's my thought. Oh, hi, Joseph. Let me read his question.
Do you want me to read it so the audience
well, yeah,
can
maybe
hear it?
that would
So
be good. Yeah.
Professor Sorensen has this comment. I work at a large tier 1 research institution. Our Japanese program has had huge enrollments, but is mostly language and literature. Japan studies scholars and other departments, what you called silos, have all but disappeared. It's frustrating that we have 100 Japanese majors and no art historian, anthropologist, sociologist, political scientist, etc. on campus. And once upon a time, we had all of those, and the future looks bleak. I think your ideas are wonderful, and schools like mine should start to think about teaching outside our discipline comfort zone courses in our department, as well as collaborative cross-cultural courses. Sorry this is so long, but if you have any comments, I'd be glad to hear them.
Well, I just want to say, Joseph, I really sympathize with that. We're, like I say, we have these there's three Asianists in East Asian studies here. We're fortunate to have somebody in ceramics that does a Japanese pottery course, Japanese ceramics course. We have a Buddhist scholar, right? And that's it. That's it, right? But we are a very small school. We are fortunate to have 4 people in a campus of 110 faculty. It is disturbing to me when I start to realize that much larger institutions lack the same resources. And I have personally bumped up against another challenge. Like, for example, our history program. I'm trained as a historian. Our history program lost a number of years ago to the State Department. They lost the one person that would teach any Asian history. She left for the State Department. And so there have been very few offerings in world history in East Asia, none for years. We actually have a master's program that puts people into the schools as history teachers. So it seems like this would be a nice addition, right, to the history course lineup. I, at the time of hire, probably very cheekily mentioned to the chair of the history department that I would be happy to cross-list some of my courses, which took a very historical approach for history credit for the major and in support of that teaching certification. And I was politely but immediately rebuffed. And that position has not changed, even though it would serve the curriculum, it would serve our teachers program, it would solve a number of problems that are posed constantly to history majors at our school. So, you know, I say break down the walls of the silos, but there's going to be resistance, even from well-intentioned colleagues who want to protect the territory, what little precious territory we have left, right? But I think that I say that we have to break down these silos, Joseph, because of this bleeding, you know, we have people retire and then the lines are not replaced. I doubt that you and I will ever be able to impact that in a meaningful way. We'll try, right? But the only way to really impact it is to have such a demand for the courses and a call for the courses that the institution itself is compelled to, you know, to put in another tenure line to replace the line. And there's so many pressures financially sort of pushing the other way currently. So yeah, it's a difficult problem and I wish I had more answers. My approach has been to think, what is in my purview, right? And what's in my purview is the energy that I create in my department and around my courses and with my students. And that might be the limit of it, realistically.
Thank you. There's another question from Dr. Tsutsui, but before that, I think you have a unique positive energy that, you know, for some of us, we have to really work hard to be, you know, as open as you and, you know, work so hard to do these things. But obviously it's worth the trouble. So Professor Tsutsui has one question. Do you think that you could have been as imaginative in creating new courses and programs at a large research institution? Is this easier at teaching colleges and universities such as Austin, where the focus is on students and where, at least in my experience, interdisciplinary work is more easily accomplished?
I do not think I could have done it as easily at a tier 1 or R1 institution. I mean, that's the simple answer. I absolutely do think that the kind of institution that I'm at I came with this natural orientation to this work, you know, by dint of being involved with NCTA and other institutions. But I found in Austin, one reason that this college was a fit for me is I realized that I could continue to do it here. And I realized that that is not typical. Every other campus at which I was a finalist would have had me teaching a world history course. Bill, when I first arrived at KU, gave me a piece of very good advice that I disregarded, and I wish I hadn't, which was that one of my secondary fields should be world history. And at the time I resisted it, thinking, you know, I was just like, you know, blinders on, I'm going to only teach Japan from now on forever and ever, amen. That's not what happened. And I'm actually, you know, in retrospect, really glad that didn't happen. But every other opportunity that I was looking at on the job market 5 years ago would have been at a tier 1 or tier 2 school in which I would have been in the history department. And I probably, in addition to teaching some courses that would be highly defined and not by me on the schedule, I would probably also be teaching at least one section of a world history course And often while I was on the market, I thought, oh, I wish I had listened to Dr. Tsutsui and taken a second field in world history, because I would have been a lot better prepared to do that. As fate had it, I was fortunate. I did not have to do it. So, and I know so many people who teach in these kinds of programs. Now, that said, there are these opportunities to step outside. For example, I think of my colleague, Zach Smith, who's at the University of Central Arkansas. Zach is a historian of China, but he's gotten involved with NCTA. And it took some convincing, but a couple of years ago, I got him on the phone. We had a mutual friend. I wrangled an invitation and to talk. And I told him, you know, I knew he had held this wonderful event in I think in collaboration with Hendrix University on Korea, like a one-day event. And it was for a lot of in-service teachers. But he felt like, oh, I really only know China. I can't possibly speak to Korea. And I said, actually, you can, and you should. And so I've slowly brought, I think he was amenable to it, but I've brought him more to my way of thinking. And we've had conversations around that. And we both feel that this has enriched our teaching in our primary content area. I feel like I teach Japan better now for having studied China and Korea and taught China, Korea in depth. It's a more holistic picture. Right. And then when I share that material outside of just the classroom, I mean, the classroom, obviously my most important audience, but when you share with the general public, that's a kind of service to the community that I think colleges should do more of. And if we could build those bridges better, I think our enrollments would benefit, right? Where do our students come from? They come from the middle and high school classrooms of the communities that surround us. If we can help those teachers, if we can reach those populations as younger students, it can have a tremendous impact. I've seen it happen. And I think, what is the number one thing I can do to ensure the health of my institution? I can make sure that people still want to come to Austin College because they've been exposed to me or other educators who get them excited about the kind of stuff that we do here, right? But that is the privilege of a teaching institution, to be sure.
Yes. I'm sorry, I don't see any other questions at this point. Is there any, final comments you'd like to offer to us? And if not, we could end a little early.
Yeah, well, I would just say that, I think it's easy and it's tempting to be morose. Yes. And God knows I have my moments. Yes. Right. But I think if at the point where we lose our joy in what we teach, we really are done for. Right. I was attracted to this field because I had wonderful teachers who got me interested and excited in the material. And, that for me, that made all the difference, in the direction that I went as a young adult. And I've seen that happen for my own students, the ones that really light up when they get an idea in their head. And that's what attracted me to teaching. And I just really feel like if we allow ourselves to lose that altogether, we might as well go into the corporate world because that to me is absolutely the core thing that brought me to this profession, right? And so, call me Pollyanna, fine. I don't want to lose that because my professional life day to day is infinitely improved by trying to have this outlook, right? I'm not blind to what's happening in higher ed. We're in trouble, no doubt. Yeah.
But I actually think, despite Professor Tsutsui's, question about the differences in types of institutions and the kind of added burden that scholars have to publish in other universities, that your basic advice, I think, is still very valuable for us to embrace teaching and researching and doing new things outside of our comfort zone. And, it could be that, for example, if I were to teach a new course on K-pop. I mean, I haven't, but let's say I decided to follow your footsteps, and I didn't like it, I wouldn't do it again. But it's possible that it would be, again, motivation for me to go to Busan and Seoul and, to do some research or teach it again, and it would attract students. And so I think, for all of us, this giving ourselves permission,
Mm-hmm.
like you did, to teach things that will help our program attract students and possibly enhance our own research and our own lives in some way. I think that's just wonderful advice. And, I know that there's always going to be naysayers, and they'll say, well, I have to do this, and I wasn't trained to do that. I only, I spent 20 years learning Japanese. Why should I try to learn Korean? This kind of attitude makes it pretty hard. But I think that you're setting a really good example for many of us. And for that, I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And Laura, I mean, I'll say that we live in a world in which expertise is under attack, and that is deplorable, genuinely, right? Expertise matters, but first of all, we know how to acquire this expertise, right? And expertise in the student's eyes is a very different thing than trying to go out and write a book on Korea, which I don't see myself doing. Right. Public scholarship is not the same as the kind of scholarship we produce for each other.
Yes.
But both can coexist, right? So I think maybe that's the takeaway.
That's a really good point. So I think we will end a little early today, and I want to thank you very much, Dr. Landick, for marvelous presentation. And I know a lot of us learned some things from it. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a lot of